So from beginning, got it. It seems like if I try to make it bigger, I don't know, it just yells at me or something. Can you see this?
Yes, we see the background slide.
Okay, great. Okay. Um, so like I said, I've just got a few slides here, and I just wanted to give one slide on the background and information of the survey, which Laura talked about, and I'll just give a little bit more, that indeed this is a collaborative partnership with the National Forum of State Workforce Centers. And the origins of this originally began as HRSA's National Sample Survey of Registered Nurses. They had been doing a sample survey every 4 years from like the 1970, in the presidential years, from like the late 1970s up until 2008, consistently. And then it was announced after the 2008 survey. I don't think anybody found this out until around 2011 or 2012, that they didn't have the funding and wouldn't be continuing it. So NCSBN and the forum scrambled to put something together, and they put a survey out in the field in 2013 of registered nurses. And then we continued on and did another one in 2015, this time including LPNs, adding that into. And then we followed up in 2017, 2020, and now the most recent survey was for 2022 data, and the results were published in April of this year. And we are in the process of planning our 2024 survey next. So we've been conducting this survey every couple of years, and I think it has a pretty good reputation. It's beginning to be very widely used. So that's just as a background for what this is. And the survey asks many questions, but primarily the data that Laura asked me to look at focus on 3 questions in the survey that are asked to employed nurses. And one of which is, are you a travel nurse? And then a follow-up later on is, do you hold a multi-state license? And if people say yes to, do you hold a multi-state license, they are also asked, how do you use that multi-state license? And so the results, as a summary of the results nationally, this is what we have. We have that we think there's a little bit over 1 million RN multi-state license holders out of the entire population of RN nurses. And out of those, 122,000 said, yes, we are travel nurses, or about 12%. Now, out of those 122,000 travel nurses, when they were asked that question of how do you use your multi-state license, 96,000, or almost 3/4 of them said yes, they indeed do use the multi-state license for travel nursing. So they do take advantage of that. And just as a quick summary here, so I mean, what we're saying is, out of 1 million RN multi-state license holders, about 96,000, or 9.5%, use the multi-state license for travel nursing. And some of this data and a lot of other data is in our publication, which came out in JNR in April of this year with the National Nursing Workforce Survey report. And so like I said, I wasn't sure if you wanted anything beyond that. I can always dive into the data a little bit more than this, but primarily at this level, we thought this is what was useful. So are there questions about this, or is there other data you'd be interested in out of this that would, questions that you'd have that I could follow up on? So.
And can you go back to the previous slide as well?
Sure.
Sure. Yeah, it's a lot of numbers to take in, and
yeah,
so
it is. Yeah, it is.
If we just keep our eyes on the screen for a little bit, that might be helpful for people as they try to wrap their
Yeah,
I'm trying to speak. Words aren't coming out of my mouth. They try to wrap their minds around the numbers. So if I can provide some context as well, as while people are thinking of questions. Last week, or last meeting 2 weeks ago, Carrie presented a small survey in our state that had basically the same questions. And those questions were, are you interested in a nurse license compact? Would you get a multi-state license if we had that option in our state, and what would you do with it? And so this is the national data. And for context, and I think what Nicole has also shared is that there is already people who have a multi-state license compact who have a Hawaii license. There are people who live in Hawaii and have many other states' licenses, or kind of a mixture around. And so there's a lot of different ways that nurses may become available to us, or may show their willingness to work. And having them have a Hawaii license and live on the continental United States is one way to kind of guess interest in working in Hawaii. But then the multi-state license compact, then you can also see the ability if we were to join. And so you have to kind of, you kind of have to imagine what this environment would look like. I think we also have Mary Hamilton. I don't know if you want to comment. I think you have some good experience with this as well. But what we're looking at here is nationally, the sample of nurses who responded to this survey. This study was able to estimate the number of people who have a multi-state license, who also say that they work as travel nurses, and then who are using it, who are travel nurses, and then are using the multi-state license for travel nursing. So you kind of you're looking at two different types of information here. Are there any other questions, or does that, I don't know if that context helps a little bit in terms of the conversations we've been having in the previous meetings, working group members. And if you have any questions, I will stop talking now.
Laura, this is BJ. Tell me what the protocol is for, do I raise my hand?
Oh, no, yeah, please go ahead and chime in.
Okay, hi, Richard, thank you. This is BJ Bartleson from Hawaii ANA. I suppose you probably don't have any more drill down per state. And Laura may know, I think what intrigues me is how many RN travel nurses do we have in Hawaii on any given day, or maybe during COVID or whatnot? And would we have any sense of how many of them have multi-state licensure?
Yeah,
it's probably the great unknown.
I mean, I can certainly get that. If you, it's like I'm sort of trapped between sharing the screen and not. If you allow me to stop sharing, I could look some stuff up while you're talking.
Yeah, if you can stop sharing and look up. I will say the interesting thing about this study, and maybe, I don't know, Carrie, I saw you were on the line, but I don't know if you are available to chime in. We asked that and tried to explore that question. The interesting thing that Carrie will be able to articulate more is that this is about licensed nurses, not necessarily residents. And so it might actually be quite informative, but we just have to imagine that data in the way that it was collected. So I don't know if Carrie, you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I was actually dropping a note in can you guys hear me? I don't even know if my mic is working.
You sound great.
Yes.
So I was actually just dropping a note in the chat that one of the things that we have in the 2023 nursing workforce supply data for the state of Hawaii is the proportion of nurses who have a multi-state license among those who are working in the state. We also can cross that against who are travelers. So we can drill down to those questions. We're going to come out with our data tables. PVL came out with its license counts at the end of last week. So our data tables are coming out at the end of this week. But that's kind of a question we wouldn't put in the data tables necessarily, but I will make sure that for the purposes of this working group that I get the data that speaks to that question specifically.
Awesome. Thank you.
And then from the workforce survey, basically, I did do a state breakout of this, and this is what Laura is referring to, because when you hear the number, you're going to say, wow, that's high. I previously said nationally that 9.5% of the entire multi-state population use the license for travel nursing. When you look at who has a Hawaii license, that proportion becomes 17.1%. But once again, that's the context of, we're looking at everybody, the way our survey is designed, we're looking at nurses who have licenses in Hawaii. And so it's not just those living it, there's a lot of nurses that we're capturing from other parts of the country who indicate it. Like, once we do it on that basis.
So run that by me again. So 17%
Yeah,
of Hawaii
yeah.
license owners not necessarily living here.
Correct.
Okay.
Or yeah, that would be it. Or 17%. Actually, I think the way it's worded, 7 of those in Hawaii of those Hawaii license holders who hold a multi-state license of any sort, and that obviously wouldn't be a Hawaii license, but of those who have a Hawaii license who also have multiple, 17% of them use it for travel nursing. That's the way to say that, because the figure I had was, what proportion nationally use it for travel nursing? That was 9%, but specific for those who,
got it.
Yeah.
And does that make sense to everyone? So you can live out of state. So if you're living in Georgia and you have a Hawaii license, if that was, the way that data is being interpreted here is that if they have a Hawaii license and a multi-state license, and then they also said that they have a multi-state license because they're a resident of, let's say, Georgia, and then they also hold a Hawaii license, and then they also say they're a travel nurse. So there's kind of like these layering of data that's happening. So it wouldn't necessarily be residents of Hawaii, it's license holders.
Yeah.
Jen?
Yeah, I guess a follow-up question to that then, I think, is kind of around some of the past meetings we've had around sort of the potential revenue stream or revenue loss. And I guess the question I'm asking is, that 17% then is currently not contributing revenue in Hawaii. They're contributing in another state and or through the multi-state license compact, or are they doing it in both now?
Currently, if they're a resident of another state and they have a multi-state license compact, all of that revenue is for their resident state. And then in order for them to get a Hawaii license, they would need to apply to Hawaii and pay the fees or the dues. And so that 17% is contributing to revenue in Hawaii and supporting, the departments that receive those fees.
Okay.
Paige?
Okay, yeah, I'm just wondering if those were some of just as a follow-up, I'm just wondering if there's some percentage of that came through sort of the emergency proclamations over the last several years.
That's a good question. So if they're saying that they're holding a license, then they have a license. So they may, there's the people who use the emergency proclamation and never got a license wouldn't show up on data in this case.
Okay, thank you.
So these are the people who, whether or not they used the emergency proclamation, they certainly went through the licensing process.
And I think, just to piggyback on that, Jen, is so does this only includes like a regular license, not a temporary license?
The temporary license right now, and Chelsea, I don't know if you want to opine on this or comment on this, but with the start of the COVID pandemic emergency proclamations, the temporary permits stopped being issued. And so the fielding period for this study, Richard, was what?
We were in the field in 2022 from roughly February of 2022 to Labor Day, give or take.
Thank you.
It was kind of like February, or actually it was closer to March, I should say, March through Labor Day. That's when it was in the field.
Thank you. So if using that timeline, then we can surmise that temporary permits were not being used, or that if they were using the emergency rules for temporary permits, that they also went and got a license. It's kind of the same answer as Jen's, like whether or not they used the emergency proclamation or the emergency rules, they ended up having a license.
So can I just ask a question? Just so does no one currently have a temporary license to practice as a nurse in the state?
Chelsea, do you have
So
the
either
answer to
you
that?
need to be here under the waiver, or you have to have a full license.
Currently, I mean, so we have the emergency proclamation that's allowing them to come into the state without a license.
So, but no one has what would be considered an issued temporary license from.
Correct. We don't have
I
that
just,
in process
yeah.
because that was the emergency rules, but they've expired.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
And then Richard, you didn't share this, the individual screenshots of how many people hold a multi-state license and who use of multi-state license holders its primary use. Or if you did, you flashed through that slide pretty quickly. Do people want to see what it looks like, what the study? I'll share that data real quick, if that's okay, just so we can have that in people's minds. So this is the study overall.
Yeah.
And this is
Yeah.
also a resource that was shared to everyone. So this whole study, but it's table 21 and table 22 if you want to go back and look at it after this meeting.
Yeah, and table 22, as Laura indicates, that was, as you see, travel nursing isn't specifically listed there. What's listed there is 20.4% for other. And when we broke down the responses that were given for other, it turned out that's how we came up with the 12.1% for travel nurse, because everybody who filled in the other did say what the other was. And primarily, 60% of that was for travel nursing. 60% of the other category was travel nursing, which results in 12.1% there doing it for that. And as you can see, 8.9% for telehealth.
Okay, well, this has been really helpful. When we're talking about a multi-state license, we have to not think about who our local workforce is necessarily, but who would be available out of state. And I think that this conversation is really helpful, Richard, to give us a picture of what, what that different environment may look like. So I want to thank you for that. Our next two speakers are from the National Forum of State Nursing Workforce Centers. And I know you've worked with them as well, Richard. So if you and Nicole want to stay on the line, you're certainly more than welcome. But at this time, I'm going to move to our National Forum of State Nursing Workforce Centers panel. I'm going to invite Reina Letourneau, who is the Florida Center for Nursing Director. She is wonderful, and she's coming in. She's the incoming president-elect, so she's in a vice president role right now for the organization. And then Jana Bitton, who's the executive director of the Oregon Center for Nursing, and just left as the immediate past president. So we've got the cream of the crop here for the National Forum. I'm going to ask if you could both, and we provided the questions in advance, but Reina, if you could talk about what the National Nursing Workforce Research strategies are and how the forum leads that initiative. What are the national practices, uses, and limitations? And then Jana, if you, since you've done so much work on trying to kind of uncover where data gaps are in our national strategy, if you could talk about that. And then we'll have an open discussion afterwards. And then I know that a lot of you will be thinking about how this impacts Hawaii. So I do want to say that we are going to have the session after this will be listening to Carrie talk about the local data effort. So I just want to put that in your views. And so with that, Reina and Jana, thank you for joining us. And you should be able to share a screen if you want to provide a presentation.
Thank you. Jana, if you don't mind, may I start, or are you okay with that?
I think you should start. I do have a couple of slides to show just to make sure people can visually see what it is I'm talking about, but I don't have to show that yet.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay. I have some slides too. And so if you all can bear with me while, like Richard, I'm more used to Teams lately. And so it just takes me a second to look at what I'm clicking on within Zoom. But I believe that I am slide screen sharing and you can see my deck now.
Great.
So instead of entering a new slide, let me start that slideshow. So you caught me with that. All right, thank you. So the way that my screens are set up here is that when I am screen sharing, I can no longer see the panel. So please interrupt me at any time. I probably won't see a hand raise or anything like that. So feel free to interrupt me if you have a question. But I do bring you greetings from the Florida Center for Nursing. We are a state workforce center headquartered at the University of South Florida. As Laura so wonderfully, thank you, Laura, for the introduction, explain to you that I am the president-elect of the National Forum of State Nursing Workforce Centers. And so I would like to be able to tell you the work of the center and what we are doing nationally with our minimum data sets related to nursing supply, nursing demand, and nursing education. But then I thought it would be, or I hope it will be helpful to the group on the call to be able to give you some exemplars of a state workforce entity from Florida and how we utilize the forum's minimum data sets for supply, demand, and education to guide our work at the state level. And so usually when I do a presentation nationally, I'll say greetings from Florida, and my first slide will have like some beautiful sunset or palm tree. And then I thought, this audience, I would not be able to impress with a Floridian palm tree, probably, or sunset. And so I imagine you all have your beautiful rainbows and waterfalls as your intro slide. So I'm going to get right into the nursing workforce. As Laura mentioned, I was asked to answer the question, what are the national practices? What are the uses and the limitations? And please, I'm just going to go through a couple things that I hope will be helpful to you all. So thinking about first, the background of the Florida Center, I mentioned to you that we are, pardon me, Laura, I'm just trying to advance my slides and I think I lost control.
You are on the it's not on a full slideshow. You might just be able to use your right click button.
Thank you. So can you see my background slide now? Because I'm in presentation mode that I thought I was sharing. So pardon that for.
Yeah, it is on now. It's on the nursing workforce research. It's the question. And
thank you for your help with that. I promise you I've used PowerPoint before. Okay.
Now you're on background.
Perfect, right where I want to be. So background of the Florida Center, we are headquartered in an academic institution, but we are part of our Florida state statute. We are identified in the statute and very specifically the purpose to address issues of supply and demand for nursing, including issues of recruitment, retention, and utilization of nurse workforce resources. So to be able to address all of these issues, it's important to really have a scientifically sound methodology for our research. And so that brings me to the goals of the Florida Center for Nursing. We have 3 major goals, which are identified by our statute. Goal number 1 is to develop our statewide strategic plan. Goal number 2 is to enhance and promote recognition, reward, and renewal activities for the nurses in Florida. And this is so important because we really have to make sure that as we're focusing so much on supply and then specifically our pipeline into the nursing workforce, we must not forget retention and how do we recognize the nurses that we already have, keeping them wanting to renew their licensure year after year. And then our third goal is to convene stakeholders, stakeholders within nursing, our other healthcare colleagues, our interprofessional healthcare colleagues, business, industry, lawmakers, educators, convene them all to be able to review and comment on the data that we evaluate, we analyze, and our reports. We want them to be able to comment on our data and our reports, all of our findings, to help us identify recommendations based on our data and how we would implement strategies based on their recommendations. Our statewide strategic plan starts with conducting a statistically valid, biannual, data-driven gap analysis of the supply and the demand of the nursing workforce. And so I want to take a little deeper dive into how we do that. we utilize a minimum data set from the National Forum, and making sure that utilizing that minimum data set and using variables that are defined by each state workforce entity will help us then be able to compare the data within Florida to the other states, and then to the NCSBN and National Forum's national workforce data. And so what we do in Florida, when we're looking at our supply of nurses, we break down our licensee data to LPNs, RNs, and APRNs. We utilize licensee data from our Board of Nursing. And we also ask nurses on license renewal to complete the Florida Center for Nursing's workforce survey. And that's where we're able to get self-reported data related to workplace settings, characteristics, and intention for future work. The demand of nurses in Florida, I will tell you that years previously, the Florida Center for Nursing was utilizing a methodology that they would survey the primary nursing employers throughout our state to be able to collect the demand data and the employment data. That was a very successful methodology previously, but as years went on, we started to see a decline in the response rate. So the last time that the Florida Center for Nursing was able to utilize a survey of employers as the methodology was in 2015. What we did this year to be able to evaluate the demand of the nurses in Florida is we looked at and evaluated the state and national workforce databases. So Florida's Department of Economic Opportunity has college projection reports, statewide demand occupations lists, and online job ads. So we evaluated the data there. We also used the U.S. Department of Labor's BLS data, the occupational employment and wage statistics, demand projections, and lastly, we looked at Hearst's data, the health workforce simulation model, to be able to get the information that we were seeking and give us an idea of the state of the demand of nurses in Florida. Lastly, we also evaluate nursing education, the nursing education programs, and we utilize the National Forum's minimum data set to help guide this work also. So this lays our foundation. The purpose of the nursing education program research is to be able to evaluate the capacity of the nursing program, student retention, faculty positions, vacancy rates, full-time versus part-time rates, the institutional characteristics. In Florida, we have a lot of nursing programs. So we have more than 500 PN and RN nursing programs as identified with unique NCLEX IDs. We also have a diverse type of institutions and characteristics. We have public and we have private, and within our private we have for-profit and not-for-profit. So we do evaluate the institutional characteristics in this survey, and then we also evaluate demographic characteristics of both faculty and students, because that gives us a lot of information and data as where we can allocate resources to increase the diversity of the nursing workforce and make sure that our workforce is mirroring the populations in which they serve in their communities. And then lastly, within that nursing education program research, we evaluate the NCLEX pass rates for PN and RN. So uses of this workforce data, it's so important to look at the state of the nursing workforce within our state and compare to our U.S. Census and national workforce data to be able to help identify next steps in our strategic planning, where to allocate resources, and making sure that policy decisions are evidence-based and data-driven. Our statewide workforce data, like I mentioned, we compare to the census data. We have such diversity in the counties and regions within Florida that it's important to look at the U.S. Census data and compare that to the nursing workforce data at the regional level within Florida and the county level. And again, comparing that to the national workforce data. One point that Richard was speaking to was the RNs with multi-state licenses in the U.S. And in 2020, the graph, that was shown was that 24% of RNs in the US had a multi-state license, and in 2022, 30.3% of RNs in the US had a multi-state license. And I'll tell you that in Florida, we have 22.2% of our RN workforce has a multi-state license. And so it just gives us an idea of where we are compared to the rest of the nation and what type of resources we can allocate that way. Limitations. There are some limitations specific to our Florida data and research that we're doing, our methodology. We remove duplicate cases from our data set. In Florida, we've noticed that there are many nurses that hold an LPN and an RN and sometimes an APRN license. And so what we've decided to do is to remove the duplicate cases such that we make an assumption that a nurse is practicing at the highest level of licensure, but this assumption is not able to be verified based on the data set that we use for analysis. We also, in Florida, we do in statute have a requirement for the nurses who hold a multi-state license that they must be residents of Florida to hold a Florida multi-state license. And I think that might be a little bit different compared to the exemplar that was getting presented earlier with the nurse from Georgia. But in Florida, it is a requirement that they must be a resident to hold a multi-state license. There are some limitations there too, because we have nurses call our Board of Nursing and ask the Board of Nursing what is their state of primary licensure, which the board is not able to answer. So there is some limitation there. We have a statewide count of active licenses, and these nurses, as we're looking at as active licenses, include nurses who are classified by our Board of Nursing as foreign nurses, out-of-state nurses, and we actually had unknown nurses included in the data set from the Board of Nursing. So we're assuming that they may not reside in Florida, but they do hold an active Florida license, even though by statute, they're supposed to be a resident of Florida to hold that active license. So I think there are limitations no matter which type of research that we utilize and the methodologies. And we do hope that if we make aware of these limitations, as people look at either replicating our methodology or enhancing it to meet the needs of their own institutions or entities, they'll be able to identify the limitations and hopefully make it stronger as they do more research and replicate our studies. So Laura, I'm sorry, I didn't, and Jana also, I'm sorry I didn't see the time when I started, but I hope that was 10 minutes.
You're right on time, and we're going to move quickly into Jana, and then we'll have questions at the end. I just want to provide, so Florida, Hawaii, Oregon, Virginia, or did I say Oregon? I think I did. Utah tend to be the states that have a very strong workforce research initiative. And so having this exemplar from Florida is what the kind of the standards that the National Forum of State Nursing Workforce Centers is setting and working to enable for other states. So I think that is really good context. Thank you, Raina. Jana, if you can present about kind of how Nurse License Compact may or may not impact workforce research, that would be great. And then we'll have Q&A afterwards.
That sounds great. Thank you so much. And honestly, having Raina give that example of what workforce planning looks like from a state nursing workforce center in another state, I think is a really good example of why this data is so important. So again, I'm Jana Bitton. I'm the executive director of the Oregon Center for Nursing. I am the past president of the National Forum. And in 2018, 2019, and into 2020, Laura and I very specifically worked on a white paper that never ended up being published, but is going to provide a lot of context of the things that I'm going to talk about today. And that is really about the implications of the Nurse License Compact, specifically on nursing, on workforce planning. I think it's really important to talk about this because sometimes when we talk about the compact, because it's a license compact, it's really easy to fall into, well, let's look at this from a regulatory perspective. Let's look at this from a disciplinary perspective, but we also are not looking at it necessarily from the workforce planning perspective, which is going to have a lot of implications when it comes to education, policy, employment, workforce development, all of that. I know in the state of Oregon, workforce planning is understanding what the data is related to nursing in our state is always being used for things like our nursing education programs that want to expand, and they want to have an idea about where they can expand. What does that look like? Like, for example, they have, just as for context, the state of Florida has more than 500 different nursing and PN programs. In Oregon, we have less than 32. So just to kind of look at that, it's so varied, and you have to look at it at a state level. And that's one of the things that I think is so important about the National Forum. And I'm really pleased that I get to know Laura through the National Forum and see how it's completely different, even in the state of Hawaii, than it is for us. So I wanted to kind of show you this. This is a chart that we put together from some analysis from the state of Oregon that kind of gets you an idea about what our RNs and their method of licensure that they take when they come into the state of Oregon. This is also really important as far as context is concerned. Oregon is not a compact license state. And so therefore, as not a compact license state, it doesn't really matter where you come from. You have to also get the Oregon license. When the compact was really picking up steam throughout between 2000 and 2010, you can see from the blue line are the nurses that came into the state through the endorsement process. And you can see that as the compact was being developed and being tested across the United States, having people crossing state lines and using this endorsement wasn't really showing up on the radar. But as time has gone by, we have so many more nurses that are coming into our state via endorsement. And that's important to know, because when we're talking about nurse workforce planning, we need to get an idea exactly how many nurses are in our state, how many nurses do we have in the right areas, and how do we make sure that we're providing the healthcare that all of the Oregonians need where they need it. So you can see there's a big difference now between the number of nurses that are coming in from out of state compared to the number of nurses that we are able to educate within our state, as compared to where it was back in the 2000s, in the aughts and the 2010s, right? So I just want to I put this together based on the paper that we put together, just so you can kind of get an understanding about when we're talking about workforce planning. So often, and especially right now, I have people ask me, well, how many nurses do we have in the state of Oregon? Well, it's hard it's already hard to say because of all the different kind of license types, where they're coming from, whether they're actually whether they're licensed and living and practicing in Oregon, which we know that they're, just as you have in Hawaii, there are people that are a resident of Hawaii who happen to be living in Georgia, but they're holding their Hawaii license. So you can't necessarily look at this. But this is a very simplified version of what it is that we struggle with. Let's just take these two examples, and I'm coming up with really small, just inconsequential numbers so that we kind of can understand what we're talking about here. We've got state A and state B. State A is a non-compact state. State B is a compact state. Let's just say that state A with non-compact, there will be 100 people in that state that have residency in that state, so we know who they are. But if they are not a compact state, anyone who comes from any other state has to license by endorsement. And at the end of the day, when we're counting how many people are in that state, we can see a total between those two groups of people. In this fictional example, 125. In state B with the compact, you do have the people that are within that residency, and you know who those people are. You've got that, but you also might have some other people that are in that state that come from another state that might have a multi-state license in another state, and they're a resident in that other state and they're practicing, but they will not be counted. Their data will be omitted, and state B, for all they know, they've got 100, but they actually have a little bit more. Does that make sense? This is like, seriously, this is the golden books children's book of kind of how it works. There's a lot more nuance to it, but this is kind of how I try to explain it to other people when they say, what data are you losing? This is the data that we're losing. We're losing this data right here is what we would lose. Now, it's not that these people aren't counted at all. They're 100% counted. They're counted in each of their individual states. However, all of the data that Raina was explaining just now, she's following the minimum data set that's been put together by the National Forum. Oregon also follows the minimum data set, but Florida's data is slightly, that minimum data set is just the floor and not the ceiling. There's a lot of other data that's taken into account in Florida, and there's other data that's taken into account in Oregon. Not everything matches up. And more importantly, Florida and Oregon and Hawaii, we don't necessarily on balance share our data with each other just straight across. Even if we did, because we're all friends here and we do a lot of research together, there are other states that we don't have this level of data. They don't necessarily follow all the elements of the data set that's being collected, and they don't necessarily share that data willingly. When we have done some work together to try to get that data from all of the states, thinking, what if we could just get a snapshot of time and do, instead of the sample survey like Richard Smiley was talking about, which is what that survey is, what if we did a more comprehensive survey and took all of the Board of Nursing and then cross-referenced them and sorted them back into the states where they're practicing? We're not able to do that. A lot of states either don't necessarily, some states don't have that data, they don't collect it. Some states do collect it and they charge a hefty fee if anybody wants to use it. Some states have the data and it's freely available. It's just so hit and miss. So by joining the compact, that is something to take into consideration when they're talking about the data that you will lose. That is a big impact to what data will be lost. Now, what are some of the things that people have done to try to do the workaround with this? I think in the last meeting that we had with Louisiana and Washington, they both gave some really good examples of some of the things that they did. Like, for example, the Louisiana Board of Nursing is working with their, I can't remember, one of their employment departments, where the employers are actually tracking how many nurses that they have practicing for them within their state. So it's almost like it would, in a compact state, the Board of Nursing would collect this data while the employers themselves would collect this data. That at least, and that is actually how the state of Washington is planning to make up for this gap. They're just going to have the employers do the reporting on that, which is fantastic, except that most of the only people that are required to report this are the employers that are coming from hospitals and not necessarily from long-term care or from other community-based settings. In surveys that we have done in the state of Oregon, specific to that big group of people that are coming in from out of state, 80% of them don't necessarily live here, excuse me. A large portion of those people are going to rural communities, they're going to long-term care, they're going to community-based settings, they're going into some of those areas that are extremely hard to fill positions. So we don't really necessarily know how that's going to be impacting some of our settings that are in those communities. The final question that I was asked to answer is, how do the states rectify that difference between the labor data, the workforce supply data, and then the employer data? The best way to describe it is I kind of use this analogy. You're kind of trying to describe something that you can't see, so you have to describe all the things that are around it. You have to take a look at all of those different sources that Raina was talking about, the labor data, the supply data, the employer data, trying to get at the data to try to figure out what are your demand needs going to be. You will need to look at all of those different things to come up with a picture. But just as Raina was talking about, there are already limitations. There are already problems and nuances in being able to get the data. The being a part of the compact or not being the part of the compact, there are nuances anyway, and utilizing all of the different data sources helps describe that picture a little bit better. So there you go. I was trying to get through this quick, and that's pretty much what I have. I think we're open for questions now. So
yeah, we have about 7 minutes for questions. And I saw that Nicole and Raina answered one question, so thank you very much for answering that. Paige, you have a question.
I have one comment, if I may, and then a question. I just want to know, I'll look back at the Washington bill. I think, Jana, It makes sense if we're limited to just hospital data, I would guess, but I couldn't tell you with certainty that the vast majority of folks coming in to practice as with a multi-state license, specifically, especially for travel nursing, I would say probably do mostly come in with the hospitals. I think just for some context, right, we're not just a hospital association. So for HAH, we represent all of the skilled nursing facilities, home health, hospice, and assisted living. And I know that HPCA has been on the call. I'm not sure if Eric's on today. So all of the FQHCs are also represented, and they've been very supportive. So I think part of what we're trying to do today too is talk to some of the departments and talk about how are we going to collect that data as employers. I know that when we've spoken to our members, which I think probably just between our members and HPCA, we probably cover nearly 100% of the travelers who would be coming in. Hopefully we can sort of get through there. And it was just more in the hospital. That's what I thought when I talked to the hospital association folks in Washington. So, I would hope that, and it sounds like a lot of what we're trying to figure out too, Jana, I think is what you're making a good point. I think Raina, you're making the good point too, is, it does need to be something that we as employers have a lot of responsibility for also, right? If we want good data, that's something we need to do. And I think as an association, we would take that charge very seriously. And I know Jana, our Jana, we have a Jana who's going to speak and works with Mary Hamilton a lot. Very important to have that data. So I take that as a charge, I would say, from the employer side of that being really important. I think the second question I have, we talked about regular licensure and temporary licensure. There is a licensure by endorsement statute on the books here. I don't know if the Board of Nursing or anyone, do we have anyone who has licensure by endorsement here right now, or is it?
Paige, if you get licensed from another state and then transfer, that's how it works.
Can you explain that a little more?
Chelsea, do you want to explain that?
So basically the requirements for endorsement is that you hold an active and current license that's unencumbered in another state. You meet our education requirements, which we can verify through nurses. The international applicants have a slightly different process. You have to get fingerprinted and also submit a completed NPDB self-query report. We also, even if you have like a prior disciplinary action, that's the ones that usually go to the board for review, but that's in like a short, I guess, version of how that works.
How many nurses do we currently have functioning who received their full license through endorsement?
It's on our GEO report, and I apologize. I'm actually out of the office today, but I can provide that to you after the meeting.
That would be helpful, because when we talk to our members, they've expressed that they've had issues, or they maybe don't understand that portion as much. So it might be helpful maybe to understand that a little bit. But we've had members say it, and again, it's all anecdotal. But I don't know that a lot of licensees have been. There you go, Carrie. Thank you. So we'll look through that. But okay, that's helpful to understand. Thank you.
And so Paige, and for the whole working group to clarify, there's two primary ways for someone to become licensed in our state. The first is licensing through examination. Usually that's a new grad, but there are other instances that someone may use the NCLEX. It may be a foreign nurse who has never taken the NCLEX, which is a requirement. And then you can do that interstate transfer or interstate recognition. So as Chelsea just described, that would be licensure by endorsement. BJ, you had your hand up before you came in and out.
Sorry about that. BJ from Hawaii ANA. Really helpful to have sort of both sides of the story. And I think as we grapple to try to find these mitigating measures to fix some of this data issue. So Raina, you know the percentage of multi-state licensees because they're multi-state licensees through your state, right? Yes. And so, but you don't know other multi-state licensure holders who aren't a primary in your state, correct? Or you do?
Correct. So
okay.
Thank you, BJ. That's a big limitation of what we're experiencing right now in Florida. So I can, just by counts of the data that's provided from our Board of Nursing tell you what percentage of the workforce at LPN, RN, APRN has a single state versus a multi-state license. But right now we're trying to look at how we can collect the data or evaluate what they're doing with that multi-state license, where they're practicing, and be able to align the data for our state to the national benchmarks from the NCSBN and National Forum's workforce study.
Well, I guess that's what I'm, is there any way to somehow make a repository somewhere, because I get it. The employers could report, I guess the individual nursee could report, but then you're relying on somebody to do something. And then, I'm trying to figure out, again, some type of mitigation with some place to make this easier so that we don't lose data. We can get what we need. Jana, your picture, very helpful, simplified and very helpful about, I think, what we're grappling with. So thank you. And I know that I think there's been other states that are going through employers. They've made, regulations to try to get the information through employers. Some are now trying to go through the nurse themselves. And I just think that's not going to be very practical either way, but there's got to be a way to do it.
Yeah. Thank you, BJ. And we are right at time to move on to our next section, which is going to be a focus on our local workforce research initiatives. If Jana and Raina, if you want to stay on, and same with Richard and Nicole, if you want to stay on, you are absolutely more than welcome, and you're more than welcome to contribute by questions, but also you're not obligated. So if you have other things to do, thank you so much for your time today. And at this time, I'm going to welcome who everyone else has met before, and Jana and Raina, well, Carrie, thank you so much for being here and presenting to us about the local initiatives.
Hey, how's it going, everybody?
And you sound really good. Thank you.
Okay, good. I've got like 9,000 computers over here because I can't function. I appreciate that. Hi, Raina. Hi, Jana. I'm glad to see you guys.
Hi, Carrie.
Friends from the forum, amazing colleagues of ours. So I have been invited to talk about Hawaii's nursing workforce and how we kind of expect, we're having a big conversation about data today and what the implications of potentially joining the Nurse Licensure Compact would be, both on the workforce itself and on the data. So to that end, I have wrong computer. See if I can, okay. I'm gonna set this mouse away. Okay, so the two things on the agenda that I have to talk about are, what are the characteristics of Hawaii's nursing workforce that are relevant to a discussion of the Nurse Licensure Compact? And then the second thing I want to talk about is, what is the value of nursing workforce data collected by the Hawaii State Center for Nursing? And I think that that is, in light of the kind of where the conversation sort of shifted to at the end of the last set of presentations, I actually think that that is extremely important for us to be talking about. So, and not just for my own job security. And then if you guys have questions after that, I would be happy to entertain them. So the one thing, just before I get into the data that we do have about Hawaii nurses, the one thing I will tell you that is going to be conspicuously missing from this presentation is any kind of estimate about the number of nurses that we would expect to see inflow into the state of Hawaii as a result of us joining the Nurse Licensure Compact. That is not a strategic omission. It is because it doesn't exist. So if you've picked up on anything from the two presentations from Jana and Raina just now, there is no way to collect those data in a way that is comprehensive. So they're not going to end up in one data set. We have a fractured data collection mechanism. Realistically, NCSBN is in the best position to provide reporting on how nurses migrate across state boundaries when they have a multi-state license. But that sort of capacity is more theoretical than anything else. They could use e-Notify, but the problem is not every nurse is in e-Notify. Not every state uses e-Notify for the collection of data in the minimum data set that our friends from the forum were just talking about. So there is no data to talk about what we can expect to come in. And I feel like that's an important note before we get into the rest of this presentation, because if you read the preamble to both this working group, the Senate Concurrent Resolution 112 that brought this working group into existence, as well as the preamble for pretty much any other version of Nurse Licensure Compact legislation that has been introduced in the state of Hawaii, the argument for joining the Nurse Licensure Compact from a legislative standpoint is predicated on the fact that it is going to alleviate a nursing workforce shortage. That is, in fact, not demonstrable by any data. And as a matter of fact, it's not the intention of the compact. So I just want to be very clear about that fact. We are not expecting a significant inflow of nurses as a result of joining the Nurse Licensure Compact, because that's not how people make choices in life. And it is not like, I was having a conversation with the folks at NCSBN, and one of the things that one of them said to me was like, oh my God, all the nurses in Arkansas really want to work in Hawaii. Sure, cool. And they could do that right now if they wanted to. But just because Hawaii joins the Nurse Licensure Compact doesn't mean that some nurse from Arkansas is going to think to themselves, oh my God, thank goodness Hawaii finally joined the compact. I am now going to change my career, become a travel nurse, fly halfway across the North American continent, halfway across the Pacific Ocean to the most isolated habited landmass on the planet and the most expensive state to live in the country to become a travel nurse. If they wanted to do that, they would have just spent the $200 to get a license in Hawaii and done that anyway. So the notion that joining the Nurse Licensure Compact is going to result into a significant inflow of nurses from other jurisdictions is a myth. And I want to say that very clearly for the record before I proceed. Any questions on that point? Fantastic. So let's talk about
Carrie, sorry, this is Paige. Can I just clarify when you're talking about the findings, are we talking about Article 1 in the model language, or was that findings that were put into the Hawaii state bill?
I'm sorry, are you talking about my reference to the preamble of the legislation?
Yeah, because there's the Article 1 findings and declaration for the compact, which I'm just trying to read.
I'm merely pointing out that the rationale for joining the compact has been historically to address
I'm just thinking, Carrie, I'm just thinking in terms of if we do, right, if there's a bill, that's important to keep in mind, because findings are really important, right, for legislative intent. So if a bill comes up, then that's something that we definitely need to keep in mind in terms of the drafting, because I think that, that makes sense. And so if that was in the findings on the state draft, then that's something we can look at, right, as a group. So, yeah, that's important.
Yes, any reference to any data that demonstrates that a workforce shortage will be ameliorated by joining the Nurse Licensure Compact doesn't exist. Okay. Having said that, we're going to talk about what is true about Hawaii's nursing workforce, and these are data that we do have. So I'm happy to provide all of my source citations. Source citations are important, friends. So the first thing I want to talk about is the question is how many nurses work in Hawaii? So we start always with the licensing data. So thank you to PVL for their annual GEO report. Just came out on Friday. It's like Christmas for me when this report comes out. So what these data tell us is the number of individuals who have a Hawaii license, regardless of their residential location. So I have them all here for all the license categories. We predominantly focus on RNs because they're the largest subset of the workforce, but the compact obviously pertains to LPNs and RNs. So what you can see here is that we have about 29,000 RNs and 1,600 LPNs who have Hawaii nursing licenses in the LPN and RN categories. The percentages there that I have next door to each of those figures is the proportion of the total who live in Hawaii versus the mainland versus foreign. So you can see that about 44%. So this is a question about, the GEO report, to be clear, doesn't actually provide information about the number of individuals who were licensed by each method. So there's licensure by examination and licensure by endorsement, and the GEO report doesn't provide that information. What the GEO report does provide is the proportion of individuals who have a license by any method who live in state or out of state. So what we have here is that 44% of the nurses who hold a registered nursing license in the state of Hawaii do not live in the state of Hawaii. So I just want to make clear that like this conversation around, do we have nurses that we could recruit from out of state? These are nurses who probably came in at one point, who may have worked here previously and have left, or who are travelers. There's plenty of reasons. I don't know if you guys know nurses, but nurses will hold on to their licenses, whether or not they have intention to work in a geographic area. So this is just what we know about sort of the composition of where people who have a Hawaii license actually reside. From here, we start talking about who's employed in the state. I see Jen, your hand is up.
Yeah, sorry, just a quick question.
Sure.
The 44% for the 13,000, are they potentially in multi-license compacts, or are they have a separate one just for Hawaii?
So there seems to still yet be confusion about how licensure works. So yes, they absolutely could live in a compact state, and they could have a multi-state license from that compact state.
Okay,
So
okay.
licensure in Hawaii is entirely independent of
Yep,
anybody
yep.
else's multi-state licensure, right? So
Yep,
yes, to
gotcha.
answer your question,
Yep.
yes,
Thank you.
sure thing. So this is what we know about the total number of people who are permitted legally to practice nursing in the state of Hawaii. How many of them are actually here? That depends on what data source you look at. And there's reasons for the variation in the numbers. And I'm going to explain to you where the variation comes from. So according to our data, this is from the 2023 Hawaii Nursing Workforce Supply Survey. This is a survey that is completed in each odd number year in conjunction with the license renewal period between April and June 30th. And this is done on a volunteer basis. I'll get to that in a second. We have the biggest sample of any of the data sources available about the Hawaii nursing workforce. So we know that from these data that about 90% of registered nurses who live in Hawaii and work in a role that is relevant to their license, it's about 1,400 nurses, almost 1,500, which by the way is kind of, I think, consistent with, it's higher than DLIR. So that gets us to the next estimate is 11,800 nurses are employed in Hawaii. This is according to DBED. This is occupational projections. I'm sorry, this is occupational wage data produced by DBED just shortly. Their estimate of the number of nurses in roles employed in the RN role in the state is 11,800. The difference between our number and DBED's number is that labor data uses the SOC code for registered nurse, which depending on your organization, depending on the position that you have, a registered nurse may or may not be working in a registered nursing role. Our data doesn't care. So if you're working as a registered nurse and you're not properly a registered nurse, we count you anyway because you're still working in a licensed relevant role. Labor data is only interested in employment by role. BJ.
Good job, Carrie. You go fast, girlfriend. I'm still back on the 44% that have a license and may or may not be here. I'm stumbling on that one. So go back to that because you mentioned we know something about them, right? We know they have a license here. They have an active license here.
Correct.
And we know that we don't know if they're working here, or do we know that?
Well, not from the license data. We know that from our survey data. So when we do our survey of licenses of nurses who are licensed in the state, we don't care whether you're working in the state or not. We don't care where you live. So this 90% here on that first bullet point that I'm estimating is based on results of that survey data. So if you have a Hawaii license and you renewed a license and you completed our survey, we know that of the folks who, so 90% of RNs who live in Hawaii work in a role that's relevant to the license. So what we have there is we excluded a whole bunch of data for the purposes of understanding the Hawaii workforce. So when we do our analysis about the Hawaii workforce, we don't count anybody who's not living here because that doesn't speak to our workforce here. But about 50% of the responses that we got from our survey, slightly less, it's about 44% as a matter of fact, about 44% of the responses we got to our survey were from people who were not working in the state. So it appears to me to be the case based on that if you don't have a Hawaii, if you're licensed in Hawaii but not living here, you're also not working here for the most part. There are going to be odd exceptions to that, like travelers and whatnot. But for the most part, if you're not living here, you're not working here. Does that answer your question? You seem frozen.
Yeah, it'd be think about, I wouldn't, they've got that license. How can we get them here? Yeah,
exactly.
That
is the question.
Right?
Sure thing. And then the last sort of estimate we have of the number of nurses who work in Hawaii is from HAH's Health Workforce Initiative from 2022. They survey employers and they ask, hey, of the nurses that you need predominantly for patient-facing roles. So that's the other reason that their number is the lowest, is that they specifically confine the data that they collect to a patient-facing role in registered nursing. So they estimate there's like 6,282 filled RN positions plus another 999 vacancies. If you put that together, you're looking at about 7,000 RN positions reported by employers. So somewhere between 15,000 and 7,000 nurses are working in the state of Hawaii, depending on your data source. So that's what we know. You guys can tell me whether or not that's enough nurses. You guys as employers know that better than we do. Exactly, correct. So data is limited to HH's members. So yeah, there's plenty of reasons. And again, so Rena made this point in her presentation as well. there is a methodological constraint no matter what you do, no matter how you collect the data. It is not a perfect data environment. So as long as you understand the assumptions that feed into that data collection mechanism, you can better understand in real terms what the data mean. So this is the estimate of the number of nurses we have in the state of Hawaii. Any questions about that? So yes, BJ, your point that, yeah, that's a potential workforce that we could recruit into the state, those ones who are not living here.
Yeah.
Yes, potentially. And that's essentially functionally what joining the Nurse Licensure Compact would do, is just expand that number from like 13,000 to like
Yeah.
1 million.
Yeah, besides the obvious that, you know, they're not here because it's so expensive, but why aren't they here? And are there ways for us
Right.
to attract them here? Yeah.
That is a recruitment question that I think
Yeah.
is something that is worth pursuing.
Great.
To Nicole's question, it is not a required workforce survey. There was a legislative effort last year to make that a mandatory survey. It didn't fly. Laura.
I just want to remind everyone that NCSBN previously reported the number of people who have a Hawaii license and list their primary state of residence in a nurse license compact state. And that was just under 7,000 nurses. So those folks, that 7,000 would fall under the 14,000 out of state nurses, if you're trying to like put pieces of information together.
Correct. Thank you for that note, Laura. Okay, so next thing I want to talk about is where do Hawaii nurses work? And the reason this is important data is because we see variations in people's plans for the future depending on where they are employed. And so when we talk about what are the possible implications to the workforce, according to our data, should Hawaii join the Nurse Licensure Compact, please understand that we're not going to see a uniform impact across all employment settings. Rather, we're going to see some variation depending on where the proportionality of the workforce is and how the workforce is affected in each setting. So I'm going to focus on RNs. I have all the data here for your reference, but I'm focusing on RNs, again, because they're the largest subset of the workforce that is impacted by the compact. You can see that 48% of nurses in Hawaii report that their primary employment location is an acute care hospital. This, by the way, is a little bit different than most data in other states or the national findings, where we're seeing up to like 60% of the workforce in any given state or nationally working in hospitals. So we're a little bit odd in that respect. This matters because when we talk about, you know, the page alluded earlier to travel nursing, predominantly they're going to come, or maybe it was BJ, sorry. But they're going to come in and they're probably going to go to hospitals. And so, yeah, sure. So if we talk about the benefit to bringing in travelers for that hospitals, sure. Are the other settings going to be similarly impacted? Not clear on that. So that's the sort of distribution of settings. And then 11% of registered nurses work in post-acute long-term care, which includes rehab hospitals. And then everybody else is working in a variety of other settings. By the way, that other setting includes academic institutions. So now that you have kind of a sense as to where our nurses are working, I want to talk about some findings that we have about retention. We asked a gazillion questions approximately in our workforce survey. The survey is based on the minimum data set that Jana and Raina alluded to earlier, but we have added a bunch of other questions because we're curious about things we want to do workforce planning. And one of the things that we needed to add were questions related to retention. So we have several questions related to short-term, really, really short-term, that is within 1 year, and then longer-term retention within 5 years. So here's what we've learned. 64% of nurses are likely or very likely to remain in their current position for the next, oh, it's missing the number, it's 12. It should be 12. 64% of nurses are likely or very likely to remain in their current position for the next 12 months. Yay! That's awesome. That's a signal of workforce stability, and that makes us really happy. So that's great news. But like I said, there's a little bit of variation by setting. So we have 10% who are reporting that they're likely or very likely to leave. We have 26% that are uncertain about whether or not they are likely to remain in their current role for the next 12 months. Likelihood of leaving does not vary so much by setting. That is to say that percentage of people who say that they're very likely or likely to leave doesn't vary very much by setting, but that uncertain block varies a lot. And the long-term care nurses are more uncertain than nurses in other settings as to what their plans are for the next year. That is to say specifically whether or not they're going to stay in their current role. So again, that 10% of nurses who are working in long-term post-acute care, they're kind of they're probably our focus of concern for workforce stability based on these data. Oops, I'm clicking on things that don't exist. Okay, so among the nurses who do plan to leave their current job within the next 12 months or who are uncertain that they will leave their current job in the next 12 months, 13% plan to retire and 13% plan to leave the state. So those retirements, they're going to go. I mean, if you know people who plan to retire, they decide to retire and then change their mind 6 times before they actually do it. So at the time that we surveyed them, 13% indicated that they had plans to retire within the next 12 months. Whether or not that actually happens, people are notoriously bad at predicting their own futures. That number could be higher, that number could be lower in real life, but we should operate sort of conservatively for workforce planning efforts. That 13% of the workforce who plans to leave their job within the next 12 months plan to retire. That is, they leave the workforce. We have another 13% who plan to leave the state for one reason or another. So that's 26% of the 10% of nurses who are planning to, that's actually higher. It's including the uncertain folks. So 26% of, what does that work out to? 36% of all nurses. BJ.
Quick question. So the total number of nurses in the survey, 64% of what?
64% of 8,400.
8,400. Okay. And then, well, the good news is I've seen national numbers, 23% likely to leave. California,
Yes.
the number was like 26. So our number's lower.
Our numbers are
Yay.
great. They have historically been much better than the national numbers. Our nurses are more likely to stay. They're less mad in their job. So that is a testament to our Hawaii employers. For,
well, 8,400, that's significant. Okay, good.
Yeah, I'll get to that here in a second.
Okay.
It's a gigantic number of surveys. Okay, and then the last thing, I'm clicking the wrong thing. Okay, so then the other thing we asked about, so this is very, very near-term exits within the next 12 months. The other thing that we asked about was what are your plans for the next 5 years? And within the next 5 years, so that's by 2028, we did the survey in 2023, about 15% of nurses plan to retire or leave the workforce for other reasons. So that's a departure entirely of 15% of all nurses from the workforce for one reason or another. So again, not a huge number and definitely much more optimistic than in other places. So these data suggest to us that there's generally a pretty good stability in our workforce. We don't see a whole lot of nurses planning on leaving. There's not a whole lot of nurses who are looking for opportunities elsewhere. But I do want to draw attention to that 26% of nurses, particularly in long-term care, who are uncertain as to their future. So the one thing I want to talk about here is that this is important for when we talk about context. That is, what are the potential workforce implications for Hawaii's membership in the Nurse Licensure Compact? We don't have a reason to expect a huge inflow of nurses, but I do want to draw attention to these nurses who are uncertain. Now, if you were here at the last meeting, we had 2 new grad nurses who came and presented, and they were delightful. One of the things they talked about was opportunity. It would be really cool if a new grad nurse could apply for a nursing license in Hawaii and get that multi-state endorsement, and they would have more options in their career. This does not just apply to individuals who are getting newly licensed. It also applies to people who are generally uncertain about their future. There's a lot of research, everything from decision-making about careers to decision-making about commitment to intimate relationships. But the basic proposition is that if you're uncertain about something, you're more likely to consider alternatives to the thing that you have. That is the status quo. More options decrease your commitment to the status quo. So I am speculating. I don't have a good way to estimate a number, but I do want to draw attention to the fact that because we have about 1/4 of all nurses in Hawaii uncertain about their next 12-month plans, this does create a little bit of risk for if you present them with an option to, hey, you can get a multi-state license. They may not have been thinking about it otherwise. They might not have bothered to hassle to get, say, an Arizona license or a Washington State license. But if they could pay a little upgrade fee, as NCSBN likes to refer to it, and they now have the option to go practice in Washington or Arizona, where they probably have family because of the massive number of transplants from Hawaii to those geographic locales, a nurse who is working in an environment that they didn't want, they're dissatisfied with their job, or they just want to see what else is out there, there is risk for us losing those nurses potentially permanently from the workforce, initially to travel appointments, but there's a very real possibility that if they leave, they won't come back. So I do just want to note that. And again, I'm not estimating that number, and this is a speculation based on how human beings make decisions, but I do want to make sure that we're taking that under appropriate consideration when we're talking about impacts to the workforce for joining the NLC. Any questions about that? BJ? I see you. I see the nonverbals.
I can't get it moving as fast as you're talking. I think this is a superb point. I wasn't at the last meeting, but I had an opportunity to go back and look at it. And the two new nurses were interesting to hear from them. And I think you're spot on with this option opportunity business. So, and it spoke to me as, if they want this, if they want the multi-license state compact, why? What options or opportunities don't they have here? And then do we make the nursing licensure compact fit work, somehow mitigate it so they have that? Or do we dig more? Do we do a deeper dive in what those options or opportunities are that they don't have here? So I just want to yellow that, highlight it, because I think it's really, really, really important.
Thanks, BJ.
Mhm.
Paige.
Yeah, and I think actually, BJ, that's a good point too. And I would be curious, I don't know if there's data from other kind of high cost states too, sort of like New York or Massachusetts, right? What that looks like. Because I think that's a lot of the same pressures that they're feeling. I think there's been a lot of data generally, right? I mean, you talk about tech, right? And people are leaving the Bay Area and they're going to lower cost states, and then they're trying to, still hang on to careers potentially that do have a little bit of a higher salary. So I think overall that's interesting. And then BJ, I think one of the things we talked about at the previous meeting too was that affordability is such an issue. And I think, Carrie, you are bringing up the good point of, families are moving to other states. People might be following their families. And I think when people are unsure, I really appreciate you pulling out the long-term care because that's really where we're struggling, right, too. It's so hard to recruit in long-term care, and a lot of the RNs in particular are going to the hospitals because it's an economic decision, right? Especially with how expensive things are. So it's not within the scope of the working group, and I love giving Laura work. And Jana Hoshide on our team work too. My favorite thing in the world is just like, they'll solve it. But I wonder if there's a way for us to sort of allude to the point that beyond, I think, some of the implications of the multi-state license, right? What are we looking at in terms of how affordability is affecting our ability to also retain nurses and recruit, right? If we're looking at, there's all these folks who have these licenses, maybe they just said, it doesn't make sense. I tried it. I couldn't live the lifestyle I wanted. I think that is something important that we talk about a lot as employers also, but I think it's such a big topic. And I think especially for long-term care, we're really concerned about that too. So I just put that in there. It's out of the scope. I'm sorry, Laura, but I wanted to bring it up. Thank you.
Yeah, it opens up a big can of worms for sure.
It does. It's a big solvable problem. And we're out of time. My section is out of time. We need to move on to the next part of the agenda. So thank you for the lively conversation. I did, however, want to make one more last statement. You guys can fight me for taking 2 more minutes. But I did want to emphasize that the one thing, I don't believe that the loss of data from nurses who are travelers we end up not seeing in our data because they're multi-state licenses. According to our data, at the time that we did our supply survey, 3% of nurses who were working in Hawaii reported that they were travelers. I don't actually care about losing their data, if I'm being honest. What I am concerned about are conversations that we're having about, well, how do we mitigate the loss of those data? And if the decision around that is to remove control of the data collection mechanism from the Hawaii State Center for Nursing, put it with the Board of Nursing, or put it with eNotify at NCSBN, I would staunchly caution against doing any of that, because we have so much control over our survey because it came mostly from my brain with a lot of feedback from our partners. I have immediate access to the data. I can run special tables for things that you're curious about. If you have a question that you think is important for us to understand about the workforce, I can add it to the survey. That's how that well-being questions end up on the survey to begin with. We are then also, if we gave away control over the data, we would be subject to other entities' methodological decisions, which may or may not be the best methodological decisions for us. So I think that the bigger risk is, rather than the loss of data from 3% of nurses on a sample survey anyway, for me, the bigger concern would be trying to find a solution to fix the holes in the data that would relinquish our control over the supply survey data collection mechanism. So I would just caution against doing that. If you guys have more questions for me, you know how to find me. I'm going to stop talking at this point.
Harry, if you do have more questions, we had a 10-minute Q&A, but there were a lot of questions that people injected into your presentation. So if you have more, well, you were on the second to last. Do you want to do the takeaways? Or is it-
Yeah, I'll just do that. Okay. Speaking of sample, I just wanted to address this first bullet point that I blew right by. Our sample is the biggest sample of Hawaii nurses in any available data set about Hawaii. So Richard Smiley, the data he presented from the National Nursing Workforce Survey, the sample for Hawaii was 678 nurses. HRSA's 2018 National Sample Survey of Registered Nurses had 533 nurses from Hawaii represented in those data. Our survey had a total response of 15,420. When we pop out the nurses who don't actually work in the state of Hawaii, so we focus all of our analysis on nurses who actually support the nursing workforce in the state of Hawaii, our sample still includes 8,300 nurses. So when we have a big sample, we have less error, our estimates are better, we are more confident, and we have better representation from across the spectrum of where healthcare nursing care is being delivered. So all the way from FQHCs to our academic institutions to our correctional facilities are all represented in our data, which are much less likely when we deal with small samples. So then that's a secondary plug for why we should retain control over our data collection mechanism rather than farming it out to anybody else. So the big takeaways that I want to talk about are, in terms of workforce impact, the NLC will give nurses more career options. And that may result in some out-migration of nurses who are, for whatever reason, dissatisfied with the work environment in Hawaii. They can't get the job that they want. They can't work in the setting that they want. They have ohana someplace else. And they want to have a little bit of an adventure. We could see it as some out-migration. I don't have a way to estimate what that number is. What we also know, though, is that it is unlikely, extremely unlikely, because it's not the intention of the compact to cause significant in-migration. However many we get, we might get a few, but that quantity is not really estimable because of the lack of data per the conversations that we were having with Raina and Jana earlier. In terms of the workforce data impact, the loss of data about nurses working in the state under a multi-state license, these are only travelers, because in other jurisdictions, Florida, Oregon, they have neighbors. So we see migration across state borders. You live in one state, but you work in the other. We're the most isolated habited landmass on the planet. We don't have neighbors. I can't even get nurses from Kauai to Oahu, right? Or the reverse. So we're not talking about migration across borders. So when we talk about multi-state nurses in the state of Hawaii, we are really literally only talking about travelers or people who might have a multi-state license and they're relocating here and they will be licensed in Hawaii on the next relicensing cycle. The loss of that data is really functionally negligible when we try to understand the whole scope of the nursing workforce in the state. My bigger issue is that if the joint membership in the NLC removed control of the nursing workforce survey from the Center for Nursing to, say, e-Notify, which a lot of states have gone to, the impact of that loss of data and a loss of control over that data would be significant and extremely negative for the state of Hawaii. So that is all I have to say. Yay!
Thank you so much. And I just want to clarify, and I think it was your last point a little bit, is that DCCA, particularly Rico, talked about the loss of data access in terms of investigating people. That's a different use than what Carrie's talking about in terms of workforce planning. So please note that those are two kind of like equal and different perspectives, just because we have to articulate a lot of different things. And Carrie, thank you so much for articulating the impact on the data as compared to the impact on the survey, because that's also really important information. The third thing, and I think I just want to point out the collection methodology, which I don't think you addressed, is the survey is put onto the license renewal platform that the Board of Nursing runs. And so as a nurse, this is my experience, you have the link when you go to relicense and then you pay, you renew your licenses. And then this year it was so magical. It like popped up a new window and you're like, oh, I better do this thing. So the Board of Nursing contributes by making the link accessible. So they distribute the survey, but then the survey design and the survey tool is the Center for Nursing. And as Carrie mentioned, is the minimum data set plus all of this other survey that she has curated over time. So thank you, Carrie.
You betcha. Let me know if you guys have questions.
All right, we have a little bit of time later for questions. But I want to invite Paige, and I think you asked Jana Hoshide in particular to comment about how workforce data is used for workforce planning. So if you could chime in, that would be really wonderful. And hi, Jana.
I'm only going to chime in to say Jana is going to present because she's the one who really works with our data and works with all of our programs. So Jana is our Senior Director of Workforce at the Healthcare Association of Hawaii. And I am just going to let her speak to our data, how we use it, in any detail she's going to provide. So thanks, Jana.
Hi, folks. Thanks for having me today. So I'm going to talk about how critical data is for workforce development. Again, I lead the workforce development initiatives at HAH. And so what we're trying to do is better understand the demand or the number of the open positions against the supply. And so looking at how many available individuals we have to work in the workforce. And then seeing what that gap is between supply and demand to develop programs to really close that gap. So of course, as Carrie just showed, you know, the data points captured are not just supply and demand. There are multiple data points that really help us to tell a story and then also help to formulate solutions. So in general, as Carrie had mentioned, they are primarily capturing the supply data. And at HAH, we're capturing the demand, so the number of open positions. So I'm dropping in the chat here a link to our Workforce Initiative report. There's another link in there that I will talk about. So we use both the supply report as well as the education capacity report and kind of evaluate that information against the overall demand data to understand where are our biggest gaps for nursing. And so we shown from, you can see from our reports from 2018 into now, the open positions for nursing increased from 463 to close to 1,000, 999. And from our report, you know, majority of that is in hospitals. So that's a little bit different than I think what Carrie was reporting on the supply side. But again, knowing that that gap increased, we then are looking for solutions to close that gap. And the data is really critical because it helps us to formulate programs as well as secure funding. So I want to give a particular example of the LPN workforce. So the demand increased to 211 openings. And then we know that the education supply decreased significantly. So about 30 standalone LPNs are being produced against 211 openings. We also know that from Hawaii State Center for Nursing's report that, you know, a third of the workforce is 55 years or older and has 21 years of service or more. So we tend to have more of an older workforce for LPNs. We were concerned that if we did not increase the supply and students in the program, that the issue would be further exacerbated. And then we also know from Hawaii State Center for Nursing reports that, you know, we had a peak of over 2,300 LPNs licensed, and that dropped significantly to a low of just over 1,300. So because of that data, we were able to formulate new programs. And so that's that second link here, looking at how we increase the pool of candidates in the pipeline. And we created a new program with several partners, including Hawaii State Center for Nursing, as well as Maui College, to look at how to create opportunities for working CNAs or individuals in entry-level roles so that they can pursue LPN programs. And so that data was really critical in order to create those solutions, the programs, as well as get funding. And so another example is really the Good Jobs program. So I hope many of you are familiar with it. There's multiple funding sources, but we partnered, many of us partnered with Community College System in order to secure federal grants. So 2 major federal grants, as well as some other private funding. Right now, it's about $40 million for the state for workforce development. So that's an unprecedented amount of funding coming into the state to support workforce development. Not all of it is for the healthcare industry, but because of the data and the open positions and how we're able to demonstrate the need, we are the largest industry sector receiving funding. And so the nursing data was also critical in making the case to fund the nurse residency programs, to also launch the nurse specialty programs that are under Hawaii State Center for Nursing, as well as a new long-term care nurse residency program. So overall, in summary, in terms of what we're looking at and the data, it's critical that we understand both the supply and the demand, and that we have that data in order to pursue solutions and then secure funding for those solutions. So I'll pause there to see if there's questions, or Paige, if you want to add to that.
This is BJ, I have a quick question. Federal funding or state funding? You mentioned the residency programs, et cetera. State or federal funding, or both?
Yeah, we're really using primarily federal funding at this point, but I believe, Laura, for the nurse residency program, there's also been state funding.
Yeah, the Hawaii Nurse Residency Collaborative started in 2012, and I mentioned the residency in past meetings. We're the first statewide collaborative in the nation. We started in 2012. From 2012 to 2020, the sole source of funding was individual employers. In 2020, we got Workforce Development Council funding. And then in 2021, we started to receive Department of Health, Alcohol and Drug Abuse Addiction, or Alcohol and Drug Abuse Division's opioid funding, because we added on opioid curriculum. And then now we're also working with Good Jobs to expand to specialty training. So the funding sources are multiple. The primary source of financial contributions still remains the employers, because they're hiring new grads and they're also supporting the preceptors. So the funding is only supporting the curriculum and not the employment. So I just want to be clear on that.
Got it. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. We do have a couple minutes for questions. We have about 5 more. I know there was a lot of questions for Carrie, and so if you still have those, she is still present. And then Jana, thank you so much for sharing how you use workforce data to inform workforce projects and policies. I think that's really helpful to kind of think about the use case. And I think it also helps articulate what Jana and Raina had shared earlier in this session. So thank you. And we do have a couple minutes for questions.
All right, I got another one. Maybe Carrie mentioned it, e-notify. That's a new one on me, since we have time.
I'm gonna let Nicole from NCSBN feel that one.
Okay. Maybe not.
Nicole's on by phone. Sometimes it's hard. I think it's *6. There you go.
Apologies. Sorry, I was talking, but to myself. So e-notify is a process by which, so there's e-notify for institutions, by which institutions can apply for e-notify, and when they hire a nurse, they can upload that information and get renewal notifications, or if there is any adverse action taken against a nurse's license, they can receive notifications that are important to licensure. They can also verify employment through nurses, and so that is e-notify for institutions. There's also e-notify for nurses. It is voluntary for nurses themselves to sign up for. In there, they are able to complete the minimum data set, and that workforce data that goes into there is partially, and I think Richard may have dropped off, but that is partially the resource the National Nursing Workforce Survey gathers their information from, is that data that is submitted by nurses into e-notify. E-notify for nurses also will alert a nurse when they have renewal data. Oh, Richard, you're still on if you want to take over. You're the expert here.
Yeah, I can just say that for the e-notify data, for some of the states, for the last cycle of the nursing workforce, we were able to use e-notify data in replacement for surveying some of the states, because the data itself was complete enough. Like for a couple of the states, it was the equivalent of a census. And much as was mentioned for Hawaii, where you've really got everybody, for some of these states, we had that. So we didn't need to send out a survey. We just used the e-notify data. And in preparations, we used it for 5 states, 5 jurisdictions. And what's going to happen for the 2024 survey. We're going to be, again, using those states in addition to another 5.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay. If there's not any more questions, I'll set up the next panel. I just want to recognize and thank the departments who haven't necessarily been part of this working group and study, but are with us today. And in particular, we have Lauren Kim representing the Hawaii State Department of Health. We have Director Jade from the Department of Labor and Industrial Relations, as well as Mary Carr Pilotin Freitas, who is part of the Workforce Development Council, and then Jerry Sato, and is representing the Hawaii State Department of Business, Economic Development, Tourism, and is part in particular of the Research and Economic Analysis Division, and is the supervisor of the research branch of READ. That's a lot, but I just want to recognize all of the 3 departments that have joined us just to set the stage. And I think you might have gathered this a little bit, but the question, and just so everyone on the working group and our guests is also kind of prepared to think about this. So currently in our state, the Hawaii State Center for Nursing provides a link to a very robust survey. And that link is put onto the licensed, it's put onto the license renewal platform by the Board of Nursing. And so that is how we collect nursing workforce data. And the way we collect information about the individual licensee is through licensure by examination or licensure by endorsement. So it's an application where a nurse provides specific information to the Board of Nursing. That information is then used by the Board of Nursing, and if ever needed, by RICO for direct contact, as well as, for instance, if there's ever a need to contact licensed nurses in the state for emergencies, et cetera, there's this mechanism that the nurses in our state can receive that information because the Board of Nursing has collected their contact information and their emails. So there's multiple uses and multiple ways that we collect information about nurses at this time, kind of within this, within the scope of the study. So that information is how the state is collecting information from nurses. The question here is that when a state adopts a nurse license compact, then the Board of Nursing or DCCA is unable to collect that information or require a nurse who's using a multi-state license to come into the state. They cannot require that registration because the nurse license compact, the multi-state license, is in lieu of a state license. Kind of think about it like a driver's license. When I go and travel to Arizona, I don't have to register to the Arizona DMV to let them know that I'm using my Hawaii driver's license to drive in that state. So that you don't have that information about that person, or even how to contact that person necessarily. Given that, we wanted to ask, we have asked other states how they have addressed this, and Nicole actually gave us the states that have used alternates. So that the alternates tend to be that they go outside of the licensing division and they work with another state department to then ask or require employers to collect that information about their employees. So this becomes an employment data collection strategy rather than an individual licensee data collection strategy. It shifts in its nature. Washington, Louisiana, and Nicole, remind me, is it Rhode Island and Oklahoma are the other 2 states, are working on, oh, and I see you on, is it those 4 states?
I know Rhode Island, yes, they have not implemented yet, but they are working on that as well. I'm not sure about Oklahoma. I would need to double check on that.
Yeah, I'll have to go back in my notes as well. Sorry, I don't have it up. But so for certain, Louisiana, Washington, and Rhode Island is in process, are working on having another state department require employers, which would be primarily hospitals, clinics, health centers, et cetera, have required that their employees fill out the survey within a certain amount of time to basically register their place in the state. So the question to you all today is, do you have this in your jurisdiction to communicate or require information collection of employers, and how would you do it? I'm gonna let that be two different questions, but I just wanted to set that stage for everyone. So the first question is I just lost the screen. I also have so many screens going on today. How would your department be able to accommodate workforce data collection in the ways that have been achieved in other states? And what is the jurisdiction, or what is that work that you're doing now in terms of requiring information from employers? So if you could ask that, and I am going to ask the Department of Health to answer that question first. So how are you requiring, or how do you collect or require information from healthcare employers? And then would you be able to add a requirement such as those other states? Mr. Kim, hi.
Yes, I've heard people have been talking about us at this group of yours.
Yeah, you're burning.
Licensure is probably the only point of intersection between the Department of Health and certain workforce perspectives or certain data. We do general surveys for overall workforce development in rural areas, but they don't get down to an individual specific, a name or a credential per se. It's more surveillance. In terms of capacity, we'd have to think that through, given the thousands of potential individuals that would be in scope. If there are several thousand, 3,000 to 5,000 licensed physicians, my guess is that there are 3 or 4 times as many registered nurses, as well as nurses of other credentials. So that would be a significant lift. And one we don't have, again, because we license facilities, the individuals are left to credentialing policies either by their licensing boards or from Joint Commission or other external accreditation entities. So it's not a slam dunk. It would require us to think about that and probably come up with an appropriation number, if not an FTE as well. So I can take that back and think about it. Again, the only professions we regulate are licensed dietitians, and we certify substance abuse counselors. So let me send out some feelers to see what the infrastructure for those are. And then, like I said, our capacity to scale up from that is probably going to require an appropriation, and I would imagine an office assistant or 2. So I'll get back with you with more specifics.
If I can, I think, Laura, and maybe it would be helpful to hear from Nicole, and thanks, Lauren. I don't think that when we've talked to other states, generally the feeling is that DOH or anyone else would have to take on licensure. The licensure would still be going through DCCA, and I see that Rena's on, right? I mean, we want to make sure, that RICO and the Board of Nursing still have that authority, and the Model Act, right, still gives the authority for licensure to the licensing boards. It wouldn't go to DOH. My understanding in talking with other states is it's more of like a kind of survey issue where, similar to what we've looked at, I think more we've worked on some of the discharge planning for caregivers when we're looking at like the opioid template that a lot of our members use, the hospitals use when they're prescribing opioids. It's more that DOH would say, okay, we understand, right, as part of the survey, right, that you come in and we just need to make sure that this is something that you're in compliance with, but there is no requirement for the Department of Health to then also take on vetting or reviewing or licensing individuals. It would be that if DOH was to get involved, it would be more on that, do you have a P&P on this side? That's my understanding, and the list would still have to go to, I think that we would ideally have it go to DCCA, because I think, we've talked about this a lot, Lauren, and I know, Laura, you've been in these conversations, is, when people wanted to license certain certain other healthcare providers recently in recent times, right, there was a lot of discussion of having it at DOH, and we wanted to make sure it was in the appropriate department. So I think we just want to continue that. So and Lauren, maybe we can talk about it, but I think in other states, there hasn't had to be any appropriation or FTE assigned to any other entity in order to do like a secondary licensing and checking. I don't think that that's the intent.
Yeah, so like I said, like Laura said, I'm just jumping into this conversation now. Though I've we've had hallway conversations, Laura and I, about this. So I just need more information. If it's as simple, and nothing's ever simple, as through rules or statute requiring some PNP to be in place for licensed facilities to accommodate multi-state licensed nurses, that's probably the lightest touch. But I'm standing by, I'm still absorbing all of this. So that's where the thinking has gone. That is certainly less scary than a warm body counting things as they come through the inbox.
Yeah, and I think, Nicole, you just put in the chat too, I think it would be good to notice, I mean, I think one of the questions that was brought up was whether or not DOH needed to be involved. It doesn't sound like in other states the Department of Health is involved. And so, I think it's good for us to Lauren, you're another one I'd love to give work to. You're always, you're in the circle, which I think my circle's pretty large in terms of that. But, it doesn't sound like, Nicole, most people involve any other department than the licensing board. I think that there were just some questions about licensure, but maybe, Lauren, the question is, does this affect facility licensure? Or is it okay to just mandate in law that employers report?
Muted. So to clarify also, if you look at this item 3, it's hospitals shall report to the Board of Nursing, but the Board of Nursing licenses in our state, the Board of Nursing licenses individuals. And so who has jurisdiction over healthcare entities is kind of where the crux of this question is as well. So who would be able to do that in our state is that question. All right, Lauren, thank you so much. I'm going to stop sharing so I can do a proper introduction to our next department. So Director Jade Boutte and Mary Carr, thank you so much for also being present. If you can also opine on the same question, are you able to, or how do you connect with employers, which in this case would be hospitals and healthcare clinics, and then would you be able to engage in this kind of activity of requiring employers, hospitals to collect certain information about nurses that they're bringing in from out of state?
Hi, Laura. Okay, I'm Mary Carr, so I guess right now, director there.
I defer to you, Mary Carr. I mean, this is my first meeting, and it's very interesting listening to gigs on nurse licensing, I guess. So I'll pass it on to you. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Director. So in regards to the licensure, Laura, I think we would have to defer, like Paige said, to DCCA, the agency, or whoever's responsible for issuing those licensure to the healthcare industry. And in regards to the employers, I think DBED, Jerry's here. Maybe we can defer to DBED, who sends out surveys to gather the BLS data that's published online.
All right, thank you. So with that, let's welcome Jerry Sato, who is with the Hawaii Department of DBED. If you would like to also answer that same question, that would be greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Hi. So all our program or my programs under the labor research branch, under the research and economic analysis division, under DBED, they're all our funding is federal funding, and there are specific targeted survey programs. So I don't see us taking on a specific sector of a subunit under any of those in any industry. Actually, the scope of our work is specifically the BLS funded programs. So I don't see any of that coming under us under our scope.
Thank you, Jerry. So I have a question, and I appreciate all of you here. And if you can hang on, I think it would be helpful to have this informed discussion. I think this is one of the areas where we can't find an exact approximation to other states. And so it's kind of a, yeah, as Jana Hoshide likes to say, like building a plane as you fly it situation where everything falls in place. So looking at Nicole's comment, it says that employers use eNotify for institutions to report a multi-state licensee is working in an institution. And so, and I'm actually going to also ask for RICO and for Board of Nursing if you could comment on this. So having an employer, a requirement to have an employer use eNotify, does anybody have the ability to require an employer to do something? Is it through, whether it be through accreditation or certification or employer licensure or whatever? Does anybody have the ability to do that?
Hi, Laura. For Board of Nursing, the Board of Nursing doesn't have the authority to require an employer to use eNotify.
Thank you, Chelsea. Or, I mean, eNotify is the vehicle, but it would be require an employer to do something, I guess, is the thing.
We don't have the authority to require an employer to report anything.
Okay.
You know what, I'm gonna, if I can, Laura, I'm gonna check on that because I think in some of the rules, there are some requirements around the use of e-notification, at least for our long-term care folks. So let me check in with Robert Choi on our team in particular and some of the quality folks, because I do think that there are some requirements about the use of e-notify there. I don't know if it came from DCCA specifically, but I'm having a little bit of a thought bubble popping up that I think we are required. So if that can, help bridge some of that gap, then we can do that. I'll check though.
Thank you,
Robert.
Laura, this is Mary. For other states outside of Hawaii, many of them are not required by a state entity necessarily to use eNotify or a similar scenario for routine checks. However, some hospitals and healthcare systems independently on their own may write a policy for their internal processes that they do it at a certain frequency, and then they use the vehicle of eNotify to do it through automation.
Okay. And so I guess maybe for RICO, since you have talked very clearly about the challenges, particularly with the emergency proclamations of getting a hold of people who don't have licensure in the state, if Nurses was used, or eNotify was used as a mechanism to kind of register people in Hawaii who are using a multi-state license compact, would you be able to use that data source?
Hi, this is Rena. If my boss Esther's not chiming in, it's likely because she's on another meeting, I think, regarding Lahaina. Frankly, I haven't been with RICO long enough to really be able to say anything on this issue, but I'll certainly pose the question and report back to you, Laura, on anything I'm able to find out.
Okay, and I see Esther muting and unmuting, so maybe you
are. I'm here.
Okay.
Can you?
Okay, great.
I'm trying. Thanks, Rena. That's a really good question. My staff is not familiar with the nurses database or eNotify. Everything that we get is from the Board of Nursing. And so, and we would get everything, Laura. We get not only contact information, but any type of history related to a licensee that may be relevant to an investigation. So I can't comment on that question.
Okay, thank you. And then I'm trying to go to, so the second part of the question, or is Louisiana had required that demographic information be provided to the Board of Nursing. Nicole, could you actually describe how that happens? Because we asked Louisiana to be present and they didn't describe that very well. Do you happen to have knowledge about that?
So Louisiana does not require survey data about the actual nurse. It's Washington.
Oh, sorry.
That sort of was the first state to require that demographic data that the Washington Board of Nursing would collect for other nurses who they, in a non-NLC setting, that they have licensure by endorsement or licensure by exam. They mandated that for those who are employed by Washington employers, that they provide that demographic data to the Board of Nursing. So the Board of Nursing collects demographic data from multi-state licensees who are hired by Washington employers.
And what is the pathway? And sorry, we also invited Washington, and the process wasn't clearly described. And I still don't understand the pathway of how that data is, how that, like, if the Board of Nursing is requiring it, how does that work?
So and this is my understanding, and they probably weren't clear because they just started implementing the law very just in the last couple of weeks. However, so my understanding is for the demographic data, how Washington collects demographic data and survey data currently from licensees is through e-Notify. However, for the Nurse Licensure Compact, they are requiring for these multi-state licensees who are hired by Washington employers to fill out the minimum data set survey. So basically providing a link that would link to the survey, which these nurses are then required to fill out that workforce data, and the Board of Nursing therefore is collecting that data. So if you imagine this reporting structure, and multi-state licensee gets hired by, let's say, a Washington hospital, the hospital is required to report to the Board of Nursing within 30 days of hiring them that, hey, we hired a multi-state licensee that is not domiciled in Washington. That's step one. Step two is saying, and the nurse filled out the demographic data required by the Board of Nursing in the state of Washington. So there's two steps there. The third step is, of course, that they have to that nurse has to complete the suicide prevention training, which is continuing education requirement required for licensees in the state of Washington. So there's sort of a three-step reporting. It's all done as a condition of employment, and that's what's important. And I think, Laura, you were trying to garner like who would be responsible in enforcement over an employer. I mean, obviously putting it in statute, it would likely, and that this would be up to legislative drafters, but I would think the section of code that regulates employers would mandate that. But within that section, you would be talking about and describing that flow of information to the Board of Nursing or Hawaii Center for Nursing, or however you would want to construct that data movement toward. So I think that would be up to Hawaii to determine how they wanted to structure the flow of data. It's not an obligation of the NLC. This is all language that was added outside of the model language of the NLC to address acute concerns within stakeholder groups. So that's probably important to note too. There's no like compliance issues around this with the Nurse Licensure Compact. It's all about how you want that data to flow and what data you want to collect.
Okay.
And Nicole, this is BJ. So did they regulate that? Did they pass legislation to make that work as
yes, it's within the NLC bill, within the Nurse Licensure Compact.
Within the
bill,
model.
or additional.
Well, it's
outside of the model.
Okay.
Yeah. So if you can imagine, like they added the NLC to the Nurse Practice Act, right? Because that's where it sits. That is about multi-state licensure of nurses. But then they also amended provisions that governed employers, whatever department that might be, who licenses employers, and put these mandating reporting requirements under there.
Got it. Okay.
Okay.
We could get that language, Laura.
Yeah, I mean, and Nicole's been very helpful in giving us that information, and we've talked to Washington and Louisiana as well. I think so. I think this is something we still it doesn't it still is not a straight. I can't draw a straight line between two dots with the situation. I don't know if anyone else has, if you've figured that one out. I think what I'm hearing today and what I just wanted to describe, because we also are identifying other issues that may need to be introduced in order to move, if the bill were to move forward, in order to move it forward. And I think this is one of those parts. RICO has identified the impacts, the Center for Nursing has identified impacts, the Board of Nursing has identified impacts. So with in terms of accessing information about nurses, and there's different angles. I think for this question, it seems like DBED collects labor data as defined by federal standards. And so it's kind of outside of that scope from what I'm hearing. With the Department of Labor and Industrial Relations, there is employment data, but it's not necessarily, can you clarify? And Mary Carr, you didn't, there is labor data collection, but that's more unemployment labor data, is that, or unemployment data, is that correct? Or can you just describe so we understand how you collect your data and what relationship it is with employers? If you're able to, sorry. Oh, hi.
She just stepped away real fast.
Oh, shucks. Okay, well, that was bad timing. And then on my part, and then with Lauren, with the Department of Health, the relationship that you have with the Department of Health has with employers is primarily through SHPTA. Is that correct? I might have also gotten Lauren at a bad time.
The question was, what part of the department intersects with employers?
Yeah, healthcare employers. Is it SHPTA or is it OCA, or
It'd mainly be OCA. OCA is the licensing agency. SHPTA collects information for DOH, and it's, you know, that's one of the things. And I know they work with employers, right? When I was at Queens, you know, I filled out the SHPTA report and the CONs, but OCA is the licensing agency, right? And that's, you know, so do they work with employers? I don't know, but that's the greatest nexus, I would say. I don't know, Lauren, if that's the right way to think about it.
That's accurate enough. You know, Jack is trying to do different things at SHPTA, but they've got a total of 4 staff, so they may have some statutory authority that authorizes them to compel certain reporting. I don't know. But when you say employer, I mean, that makes me think of HR issues. And aside from, I would say, a joint commission standard that says licensee shall have adequate P&Ps for credentialing or whatever. Yeah, so yes, we do with healthcare facilities on a routine basis. We don't think of them as employers. So that's the nuance that
there's
the limit of page description.
Yeah, and there's probably 45 different terms to describe the same thing. So it could be that I'm using the wrong term in this instance. Facility, healthcare facility or healthcare entity may be a more appropriate term to use when speaking with Department of Health. Okay, and then with DCCA, both RICO and Board of Nursing, the primary connection that you have is with individual licensees, or do you also ever license or engage with healthcare entities or employers in terms of data requirements or jurisdiction?
Laura, for RICO, it's individual licensees.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to have that articulated because I think there's more thought around this. And I think there's more thought around it, and I think it's just helpful to have kind of who does what. Paige, your hand is up.
Yeah, you know, I have a question, right? Because I think part of, you know, we have been functioning as employers under the emergency rule we are required to submit the data of nurses who are coming in under the emergency proclamation, understanding that that might be a little bit different, right? It's not people with multi-state licenses coming in, but we've been required for, I don't know, a year or so to actually submit that information specifically to the DCCA. Is part of the concern over this that process hasn't gone well, or that there are gaps that we could address in the legislation? And I think that there are some emergency rules being considered for temporary licensure. And I believe that in those rules, there was discussion about including reporting directly to the DCCA. So I don't know if anyone from DCCA can comment on why that process wouldn't work if it was put into statute, and if there's ways that we could improve it.
Hi, Paige. I'm gonna just there's a lot to untangle there. So to clarify, emergency rules they expired August 2nd of this year, which that was the thing that allowed facilities to bring in out-of-state nurses that don't hold a license in Hawaii to practice within the state, and it was subject to certain conditions, one of which was a reporting requirement. However, that no longer exists. We don't have that anymore. We are under emergency proclamation, which has suspended licensure requirements for certain nurses to enable out-of-state nurses who have a current and active license in another state, or who are previously licensed within the state and have were never disciplined or had an encumbered license. So like, they could be like a expired license, or it was terminated for whatever, like they just forgot to renew, to allow them to practice. So separate things. Those are two separate. So I don't think you want to mix them up.
Okay, yeah.
I think it's a slippery slope there. Yeah. So the other thing is,
Chelsea,
we are amending our rules currently to have a temporary permitting process, which kind of mirrored SB 63 from the last legislative session. And it would have requirements in which we would have a temporary permit, which would effectively be the license that we can in fact discipline. We would collect that information of contact information so that RICO could then conduct those investigations and then collect a fee to fund that. So I think those are the sticking points, I think, and it needs to be understood, because I hear it being mixed around, and I think it's a misinformation that I'm a little concerned that might get beyond this group. And yeah, so
okay, no, that's helpful, because I think when we were talking about some of the emergency rules, I don't know if it was misinformation. I think it was information that was shared previously that changed. So having that clarification is very important, so thank you. But I think, you know, maybe at some point in the working group or in the report, we could talk about the Board of Nursing and DCCA's experience with having the employer submit that information of folks coming in prior, right, under those emergency rules and emergency proclamation. And if there were any major issues with that, that could be addressed, or if it seemed to work just fine. So maybe that's what we could go through. But thank you for the update on the information, Chelsea.
Yeah, and thank you, Paige, for also your question. I don't think I wasn't my question to the other departments isn't a presumption or an implication that there was a malfunctioning process for the rules. It's just to explore all the, I kind of, to Carrie's presentation earlier, what are all the options? Because it is not a process that exists in our state. So it's exploring if this process needed to be created, how, where, why, when, you know. So I think it's just kind of to understand the landscape and where that appropriate places. Mary Carr is back. So sorry, Mary Carr. I had asked just kind of simply, just if you could clarify, are you doing any data collection, and who do you collect data from? Is it employers or entities, or is there a certain way that you're collecting information, and who are you collecting that information from?
The data that we collect, Laura, and for the rest of the group, are mainly to capture the data elements of people we serve under the various federally funded programs. So as part of a requirement to USDOL, we have to capture that information. That's on one side, as well as training providers. So we have a state eligible training provider list. So those requirements we capture as part of our federal requirements.
Okay. Thank you. That's very helpful. So just trying to understand the landscape of the work that each of the department does in part. I know there's much work done. Paige, do you have another question, or is your hand, is that an artifact hand?
It's an artifact hand, which is I'm gonna steal that in the future. Okay, I'm lower hand.
Lower hand. This is a little bit of a longer meeting than we normally have, but we're actually under time. We were scheduled to end at 25 past the hour. It seems like we do have a couple more questions that we want to put onto the for our next meeting. So I just want to clarify that our next meeting, we will be hearing from the Board of Nursing to ask about, again, the licensing times by examination, as well as the licensing process. Chelsea alluded to the movement with the temporary permanent administrative rule revision process. So any additional information available at that time. We also have part of our study is license renewal and continuing competency requirements between member states. So we'll ask them to comment on that, as well as any differences between the current practices in our state as compared to the Nurse License Compact, and any additional statute changes that may need to happen. And it didn't sound like they're so that would be an update from the presentation that they previously provided. And then we're also going to be asking, because we do have the Hawaii Association of Health Plans as a member, so we'll have a panel with from them asking about their interest and contributions related to this subject. And then we are going to have the National Council of State Legislators representative, Sarah Jerriman. She's going to actually be talking about the emergency rule proclamation, because we did hear when we talked to other boards of nursing that during COVID, they still use their emergency proclamations as well as being compact states. And so just asking for the National Council of State Legislature to help us understand a little bit more about that environment, because that is important. And we are very much impacted by many, many natural disasters in our state. So just having that greater understanding about what other things may be needed. And then finally, we'll have a little bit of time to wrap it up. JC, I see your hand up.
Sorry, Laura. Who from NCSL is going to be joining?
Sarah Jerriman.
Okay, thanks. Sorry about that.
Yeah. Yeah. Any questions or comments?
This is BJ again. Laura, thank you very much. Very, very helpful. Lots of avenues to explore for sure. Yeah.
Yes. And I just want to remind everyone, this is our 6th meeting. Our next meeting will be our 7th, and then our last meeting will be on October, the third week of October. That will be our final meeting. So we will conclude our working group after 8 meetings in order to get the study into the legislature in an appropriate amount of time. And so after the October, I think it's either the 16th or the 18th. We will have a 2-week process where Amy and I will be drafting the report. We are writing the notes in the report format, so we'll be pulling the conclusions from those meetings, not using the long findings, but just the report conclusions. Will take 2 weeks to draft the report. We'll send it back to you all for 2 weeks for comment. And then we'll have to close those comments, because then we have many layers of review before we can submit it to the legislature. So please do keep that in mind as well. And unfortunately, there is so much to talk about, but we are going to run out of time if we're going to meet the deadline of our report submission to the legislature. So just do note that we can continue the conversation. It just will have to be outside of the scope of the study in order to make those deadlines. Just want to kind of put that in mind for everyone, and also ask for your editing pens to be brought out in late October. All right, so thank you so much. We'll give you 2 more minutes of your time, and I hope you have a happy Monday.